American, yes, but bigger than that. Spitting opinions, rooted in facts. Hope you aware the culture is bigger than plats. Used to be a summit, now we got a podcast. Gave you something, you would know you want it. Black American podcast, Black American podcast. You might hear something.
Hello. Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Great. Happy Friday.
Great. Thank you.
Happy Friday. I'll start with introducing the event, the panel, and then we can go into introductions. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to the last panel of the week for the Black America Summit. Today, we'll be talking about Instagram model body dysmorphia, and mental health. We will be talking a little bit about the hypersexualization of the Black female body and how it is deeply ingrained in American society. My name is Ahiela Watson. I am 21. I just graduated from Clark University with my Bachelor's of Arts. I am here because I wrote my honors thesis on the liberation of Afro-Latinx college-age women from traditional beauty standards in American society. And I will be studying this fall at Teachers College in a mental health clinical psychology program on a bilingual track. It's wonderful to be here. I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited. I will go into a little bit about our panelists. I have their bios here. So first we have Dr. Ashley. Hi, Dr. Ashley. Dr. Ashley is an assistant professor at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. Dr. Ashley's research focuses on health communication related to body image and modification. She examines how Black women manage their appearance relative to perception of health information and negotiating modification in a racial and health context. Her research has been publicly shared by Black Enterprise, The Conversation, The Miami Times, U.S. News and World Report, and so many other outlets. Next, we have Dr. Brooks. Dr. Brooks is a sociologist and professor of African American Studies at Cal State Fullerton, whose work focuses on the intersections of race, identity, gender, and sexuality. Brooks was born and raised in San Francisco, and in 2008 received her PhD from the New School in Sociology. Her recent book, Everyday Violence Against Black and Latinx LGBT Communities, uses the 2016 Pulse shooting as a launching point to examine the intersections of ideology and institutions which promote violence against Black and Latinx LGBT people. Last but not least, we have Dr. Stevens. As a developmental psychologist with a background in gender studies, Dr. Stevens is interested in the intersections between culture, sexuality. That was a Massachusetts alert, sorry. Dr. Stevens is interested in the intersections between culture, sexuality, and health. She uses an ecological perspective to investigate cultural identities, influence on developmental during adolescence and emerging adulthood. A key objective of her work is the identification of multi-level cultural factors increasing health inequities. So that was a lot. I am honored to be amongst such accomplished researchers. And we could start with the umbrella question. Our umbrella question, and once you answer, you could give us a little bit more of yourself, like an introduction, is, in your opinion, what do mental health stigmas look like in the Black community in relation to body dysmorphia?
I guess I'll go ahead and talk about, introduce, so as you said, I think you did a great job already covering. So when you're thinking about mental health, it's a broad term that we're thinking about when we're talking about mental health. And a lot of times we think about it in terms of negative or risk-taking. I think we also expand the notion to think about in terms of wellness and in terms of how Black women think about their bodies. And a lot of times the research that's been done is focused on white womanhood. There's very little empirical research, particularly when you're talking about in terms of psychology, that has been done focusing on Black womanhood, unless it's, of course, shaping it from Black womanhood in a comparative lens to white womanhood. So the idea of what's going on with Black womanhood in their bodies today is really unique in that this is the first generation, or the first generations, the last 20 years, who are really being able to monitor their bodies instantaneously. When I was younger, you had to take a picture, go get the picture developed, and get brought back. This is a generation now where you take the picture right away and you can monitor how you look. And so that requires there's a lot of self-evaluation going on and external evaluation that's going on for Black women today, particularly since there's not a lot of images of Black women in other spaces outside of Black medias. And so we're really critical about the ways in which Black women are presenting themselves and how it's shaping their perceptions of their bodies. But I think it's important we have to look at it in terms of an overall picture of Black women's where we are in terms of the generation, in terms of where we already are with our mental health, and also understanding what does it mean to be a Black woman with a healthy body in this day and generation. And so there's a bit of work that is going on. I know Jessica Saunders is doing some work. There's other people that are doing some work from psychology, but there needs to be an expanded lens and discussion about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess I'll jump in real quick. I think shame has a lot to do with it. So I think there are two competing ideologies. One is the strong Black woman stereotype, which is that we love ourselves no matter what we look like. We're strong, we can take anything, we don't need support. And then I think that there is the competing image also of shame and wanting to conform still to certain body standards. What I would add, and maybe we can talk about this later in the panel, I think earlier there was a lot of discussion maybe in the 80s, 70s, 80s, about Black women wanting to look like white women and white women being the ideal, standard of beauty. And while I think there's still some truth to that, I think that now we're seeing archetypes like Beyonce, right? Where technically she is not white, but yet she embodies a lot of traditional traits that are associated with beauty. And that, I think we can argue that some Black women, particularly those on social media, are striving not necessarily to look like white women, as we've argued, maybe 30, 40 years ago, but to look less Black. And maybe we can talk about that in terms of how race factors into what we even see as desirable or attractive when we're talking about Black women's bodies.
I think the commonality that we share in our thoughts is that, there is a lot of pressure on Black women to figure out what it is that they do want to look like, right? So we have these traditional thin ideal models that is very historic, and now they've transitioned with this new emergence of like this curvaceous figure that women are trying to replicate in this golden ratio kind of figure. So used to be 36, 24, 46 or something like that. I think that's what it is now with the 46 butt, right? And thinking about how that's over exaggerated. And when Black women more than likely probably have a shapelier figure, but those who are very thin like myself may want to strive to get to that new standard of beauty. They are engaging in methods that may not be the healthiest, or they may not have all the information to make the healthier decision. And if they can't attain that particular facet, as they're socially comparing themselves to others, they are putting themselves in a risky position to think less of themselves, to continue to augment or modify at home or in a low-cost setting that may be detrimental to themselves. So it's a lot of ways that it'll definitely impact us health-wise, but then also thinking about the mental health aspect, which I'm not a scholar in that area. But, there's a number of different ways of looking at it and how we promote kind of wellness for ourselves holistically, too.
I definitely agree. And I think, Dr. Brooks, what you said was very important about how white women being the standard of beauty used to be the focus, and now it's shifting. But at the same time, there's sort of this conflict between whiteness and that being tied to thinness, and how extreme dieting also is affecting Black women or communities of Black women. But then we also have this counteractive social movement with, for example, body reconstructive surgery like BBLs, right? So my question is, what do you think, or what do y'all think the impact of this movement within the Black community towards full like BBLs will be short term and long term?
I think it's also important we're framing it that everybody is thin and wants to be curvaceous, and the idea of a curvaceous, larger women are also being pressured by these images. And so I think exactly what Dr. Brooks talked about is that it's no longer white womanhood, but it's a shifting of it. What's interesting is when white women embrace these, then it becomes normalized, like Kim Kardashian's big butt, right? And there was lots of butts before Kim Kardashian, but there is also a large body of research that shows the butt surgeries took off after that. And then also they're readily available. Same thing with the lips. And I just read something recently, the nails. The new thing is that white women are now wanting their nails painted like how Black girls typically, what they used to call tacky nails, is now in vogue. So there's this ownership of Black women's bodies that become appropriate and become acceptable when white women do it. Black women have been doing it for years, but white women do it. And so the issue around getting Black women would be wanting it within their spaces, but really doing the whole body image is really tied to white women making it accessible. Black butt surgeries weren't widely accessible until white women started doing it as well. And again, I'm in Miami, so you can get your butt done down here for $1,000 very easily and get the injections, and women fly in. There's every other week, there's somebody in the news about somebody getting sick and hurt by doing these types of things. So it's really important to think about, it's not just about your mental health, but also issues about accessibility and when did it become appropriate and became acceptable for Black women to embrace these. And that's across the board there.
And I'll jump in. My previous research dealt with Black women, Black and Latina women in the stripping industry. So I looked at racial segregation in strip clubs and sort of how Black and Latina women managed, how they looked in the strip club environment. And so obviously some women were able to have plastic surgery or other enhancements. And I think the larger question is about access to certain things based on how you look, right? So in the stripping industry, where this is popular as well for some women, you know, the more desirable you look translates into more money, an opportunity to work at a fancier club that might be off limits to Black women unless they do certain enhancements to themselves. It has to do with a certain clientele that will enter the club, right? So it has to do with social status and I think economic status, which is tied to how Black women look, which will, you know, inform what sort of procedures they feel they need to do in order to enhance their status.
So that kind of leads me to the question of when and where or how are Black women going to win? Because if we are the archetype and the goal for these non-Black women, yet we're being excluded from spaces that we were created to mock us, right? Where do we fit?
Well, I don't think it's say that we aren't winning. And we have to remember, this is a long history. And so I know where my work came in was around the images of women in hip hop. And so you always had the Hottentot and Venus, Sarah Bartman. And then, of course, you had the welfare mama, the mammy, the Jezebel. You had all of these types of the matriarch. And so my work with Laylee Phillips, what we did was the architects or the scripts in hip hop. And so these scripts really just recreate what's been going on for years. What's problematic now is it looks like because of social media, before we could say, oh, the media presented this, is social media, it looks like Black women are presenting it. So I think that's what's really the shift. So one, I think it's important that we don't just blame this generation, that we recognize this is part of a longer history. But what's happening with the shift now is that Black women, I think Dr. Brooks, you said it well, is that our women's beauty is their social capital. That's the one thing that women use and that that we're taught is our strength and our ability to negotiate. Even if you have no money, you can use your body in some ways, whether it's like in terms of sex work, whether it's in terms of negotiating things. There's degrees we have been taught that our bodies are tools of power. And so we have to think about that, what that means for Black women and how we have learned to shift that. And then also maybe as much as we're focusing on the women that are doing all these surgeries, there are women who are challenging them. So for example, Kandi Burruss just decided to get her breasts reduced. Kay Michelle took out her butt implants. And so I think what's happening is that you're going to see women who are pressured to watch this. And I really think it's tied to your own, with the mental health, is how much you sort of are relying upon others' messages to you about your beauty, and how much media consumption you're taking and what media you're consuming is going to really shift how much you're going to buy into these images. And then it's going to affect your mental health and your willingness to go get these surgeries, versus as you get older and your mentality might shift, and different access and meanings of space and the ways in which you can see that your body is not the only tool, or you have other resources. I don't want to say that your body's not the only tool, but you have resources to be able to avoid or renegotiate your power in different spaces.
I think along with that, like you mentioned, social media is now a good place for Black women to kind of augment what their images are going to be, and be that, you know, that conception of whatever images are going to be popular. And I see that a lot is happening with, excuse my 4-year-old. I see that a lot. Yes, please. So I see that a lot. That's what is happening, is that as we use our social capital to be able to build on social media and other platforms, we're able to build outside of these networks as well. And I think what's most important in the kitchen, baby, I'm so sorry. But I think what's most important is that we are challenging the historical way of how our bodies have been appropriated, right? And I think that another part of like what Kay Michelle and like Kandi Burruss, how they're retracting what they've already done, is that they are giving into kind of that social pressure about how other women are engaging in those practices as well. Because in Atlanta and Miami, BBLs are very, very popular.
Well, you know, I'll jump in quickly while Dr. Ashley's taking a break. You know, I think it's about choices that Black women make within a capitalist society, right, that involve their bodies. And I think with the access of social media, they're able to control that narrative more. And it can be a larger discussion around why are certain, you know, body archetypes desirable. You know, there's a theory in performance studies. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's called Disidentification, and it was coined by the late Dr. Jose Munoz, who was a professor of performance studies, queer studies at NYU. And I think this kind of embodies what some of us are talking about, where even though it looks like Black women are assimilating into these already racist stereotypes that Dr. Stevens, you mentioned, I think it's important to look at, but do they do something different when they embody the space, right? So for instance, Cardi B, it took me a minute to kind of get what she was about, to be honest. Like when she first came on the scene, I was just like, what is going on with Cardi B? Like everyone made a big, you know, deal because she's a Black Latina. And then that became disputed because it's like, yeah, she's of African descent, but is she Black? Which sort of bleeds into this other conversation about race and Blackness and all of this. But I think that when you look at someone like Cardi B, maybe to a lesser degree, Nicki Minaj, it's like, yes, they are, you know, utilizing their bodies in some would argue very stereotypical ways. But is there something different that they're doing when they're occupying the space? And maybe that's something other people want to chime in on. Are Black women just reproducing always what's there? Or when they are in the space doing these performances, are they evoking something different? Are they trying to push the narrative? Maybe they're not, right? I don't have a clear answer on that. But I think that it's not as, you know, black and white, excuse the pun, that, you know, people are just reproducing negative images. I think that there are limited options for Black women and how they market themselves in various industries, and that they occupy these spaces and then they try to flip it to however they feel they can manipulate the situation.
I think that's what is exactly right. And so when we use the word ours was the disassociation, that what did you call it?
Disidentification.
Yeah, I had read that before, so I'm glad you brought it up. I need to go back. But we had used these were scripts that we created because we said there people were playing on them. And our research, and this was done in the 2009. So again, hip hop, all of these cultures have changed. But what they say is girls play with these scripts because they're things to practice with. And especially when you're trying to figure out how somebody wants to react. If I present myself as a freak, we know how they're going to respond to me as a freak. If I present myself as a diva, but that didn't mean I was that image. It was a good act to put on. It was a way of performing. And it's also safe because when we did the study, everybody knew what those roles were. They were roles that people could understand, and they were acceptable roles because Black women who play outside of those roles are often punished. So for example, we did the dyke script, and we framed from an empowered. This were women where it was framed from a male gaze, where it was a negative image of dyke, and they didn't like it. But if we framed it as an empowered woman who loves other women, that was not as acceptable. So in the space of heterosexual male presentations. So what you found was that women played for what was comfortable and what was acceptable and got what they needed. But that didn't necessarily mean that's who they were. And Carla Stokes actually in Atlanta did a lot of work on these and how girls use these sexual scripts and sexual images of celebrities in terms of their social media presentations, their names, and it might not reflect who really they are. So when you're playing with this, I think what you're talking about too, Dr. Brooks, is that it's something that you're playing with, but the degree to which you buy in is going to shape to the degree to which you're going to go and then take the next step and start getting surgeries and going further and further along.
Yeah, I think when you were talking, there's a documentary some of you probably saw, Byron Hurt, Beyond Beats and Rhymes, and it was about Black males in hip hop and, the quote unquote thug image versus who they really are. And I think there is a Black, woman component to that where because of capitalism, and I think this is Black marketing in general, right? There are only so many slots for Black people to market themselves in. And Dr. Stevens, as you said, when you go outside of that, you're illegible to be read, right? So you're not marketable. We see that with Lizzo. Lizzo's trying to do what the thin girls are doing. And then everybody's like, why is Lizzo got her butt up in the camera? And she's like, well, if I was somebody else, you wouldn't have a problem with it. So we see that when, Black women are going outside of the scripts, right? But doesn't always mean, as you said, Dr. Stevens, that they're going to go to these other steps to do plastic surgery, like say someone like Lil' Kim, where we see this really bizarre transformation of her from when she started, with Notorious B.I.G. to now you don't even know who she is. But I think that gets back to what I had noticed in the strip clubs. Sometimes Black women, because of the social and economic exclusion of Black women based on skin color, hair texture, and body size, are no longer just trying to look white per se, but just anything non-Black seems like is going to be a step up than being Black.
And even with Tiny Harris, her and her daughter for some time ago, they did like a change in their eye color, which was a very dangerous procedure. I think they flew overseas to the continent of Africa to get the procedure done. And when we see things as exaggerated as that, it's very cumbersome because then, we see it on a lesser scale in communities like ours where we don't have the money to fly to the continent, but we can go to the beauty supply store and get contact lenses and then end up getting probably an eye infection or something like that. So there's always risk associated with some of these augmentations that are supposed to escalate us to that next level.
I think in the Black community, what you brought up here is that we're talking about the Brazilian butt lifts, and again, I'm in Miami, so it's a dime a dozen. You can buy the underwear that looks, and it's a given. This is part of the culture, and I think that's part of where you are. But the other piece is, I think for Black women, and especially when I talk to women of other cultures, we have so many tools to alter our bodies, and we have to start thinking about that. Like thinking about the eyelashes. Other people use it, but it's something that you can just run to the store and get your eyelashes. The doing the nails. There's so many different things, and so when you think about it, I don't have a problem with it. But you think about, well, how come there's so much that's known within our community and it's discussed, while among white people they still do it, but it's kept quiet. It's not as, they keep it in a different sort of lens. In some ways, that's telling us that we're supposed to do it. And it's also interesting that all these things that are to change our bodies, we don't own these companies. it's very few Black doctors that are doing the butt lift. So like, that's the other piece, is like, we have to start thinking about where we're getting these presentations, or these presentations being put out there, but also who's making money, why are they being done, and what gaze are we trying to please. But again, I want to be careful not to blame young women or even older women for doing this, because I think as women, it goes back to our bodies are something that's really central for how we're evaluated in society. A man can look like anything. I always talk about that. You can see these rappers. I look at Lil Wayne, but I'm like, if he were not Lil Wayne, would he really get all the girls that you just be like, who's that little man in the corner? But a woman couldn't look like that. You know, like, you look at how, show me Lizzo, like you brought up the example. We still criticize her weight. Biggie Smalls got lots of attention for big. He said he went to talk black as ever, fat as ever, and he still was celebrated. Women were fighting over him, Little Kim and his wife. But women don't have that, because our bodies still need to fit into certain spaces. So I understand why Little Kim took the route she took. I understand why other artists take this route, and it's going to continue in that way.
And I think real quick, it goes back to Black women in general not being seen as women. Right, not being seen as desirable, not being seen as, having, the correct anatomy, right? We see this in slavery. We see this as was brought up with the Hottentot Venus, which was Sarah Bartman, and that name was given to her. We see that with the quote unquote father of gynecology, experimenting on Black women's bodies on plantations. Obviously, we see this discussion with trans women, are trans women, all of this goes back to, Black women at large, right? Non-trans and trans, all of us are trying to achieve notions of womanhood, right? Because that has not been designated to Black women.
I find this the direction that we're going very interesting, especially because I really did want to highlight the fact that, Black women should have the autonomy to get whichever body modification, surgery, or process that they want to. But I also wanted to get into the different interventions and why there could be a lack of interventions as to how we can get these topics to broader spaces, so that young Black girls, and not to say that these celebrities have any sort of responsibility towards Black girls, but young Black girls can see what I'm going to say we very lightly, because I'm not on your level of expertise, but what we see in like the research and the language that we have, right? So for example, this platform right now is a way for folks to be able to get that information from a different perspective. But what do you think are some interventions that we can promote on the ground, so that we can educate, but also like I feel like in communities such as where I went to college, it's harder to have these discussions on, well, this has a lot to do with capitalism. It has a lot to do with our history, in the Black diaspora and African American history in the United States. Like, how would we start that conversation about mental health issues that are affecting the self-esteem of Black girls and Black young women? That was long-winded. Did that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one way that I've been able to translate kind of my research into a more practical, kind of broader impacts thing where I'm impacting community and really having these conversations is to do it with actually younger children, right? So in thinking about colorism, I produced a children's book called Sunflower Child to start to teach 6-year-olds about what colorism means, right? In a very rudimentary way. And then also for them to be able to celebrate their melanin and also know the health benefits of having melanin. And with finding children, their ideas and their ideology and their framework of what the world is still so malleable. So you have the opportunity to be able to shift what they're thinking and greatly influence what they're thinking, versus if you're coming to somebody probably in your age group, they probably already experienced some type of trauma. And even with our children, they've experienced trauma that young as well. Just by conditioning of things that they see too. But that's one way that I've been able to make it make more of an impact in very small scales, but nonetheless in scale, to be able to show children or Black girls that they're valuable.
I think you brought up a good point in that people are scared to talk about these things. It always surprised me, and I think like we're talking about trauma too. A lot of times, women with our bodies, we're either taught to protect, we're either taught to not talk about them or hide them. And this goes back to Dr. Book's the idea of shame. And so we have to start thinking about ways in which we can talk about our bodies from an empowered but safe standpoint. And I think part of that conversation, like you said, is what needs to start early. But a lot of times, even mothers don't want to talk about that. And so one of the conversation I'm pinpointing mothers, not that fathers don't have a role, but the research shows that mothers are the ones that Black girls particularly have their first conversations about sex, body, empowerment is with mothers or mother figures or older mother aunts, uncles, aunts, sisters, etc. Is that we as Black women need to start talking about our bodies and talking about our bodies in terms of what are points of shame, what are points of empowerment. And so this is something we don't do because a lot of girls, you hear when we did one of our studies, they said, well, I was never told that I was pretty. I was told that I'm not supposed to talk about my body. Oh, my mother made sure that as soon as I started getting my to fully cover them up. So then it's either you cover them or you fully show them. There's no in-between discussion. And I think we have to start practicing, which goes back to the children, but also who's talking to the children, even continuing to have these discussions and over time, because there's a lot of women who are older too, who are getting surgeries as well, because they still haven't dealt with a lot of the baggage around their bodies and what we're seeing. I mean, you watch any of the Real Housewives of New York, Real Housewives of Potomac, those are the Black Real Housewives. And those women are getting surgeries all the time. And these women are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So I think it's really important that we recognize that what's happening now is going to become a generational trend and cycle that needs to be addressed. So we have to talk about it more.
And I think we don't even have to be talking about something as drastic as surgeries, right? We can talk about hair. And I think that going back to comment about Black children, particularly, Black girl children, children learn like value through visually just looking. So we can talk about how beautiful Blackness is, but when they see in their home that there's no one with natural hair, or they see in their home certain things, it communicates that straight hair or some altered state of hair is important, right? And we see this with COVID, a lot of Black women wearing wigs, that's coming back. And I think it is worth having a conversation about why that is. So we know it's complicated, right? We know it goes back to a lot of times in the workplace, you can't wear your hair natural. I mean, California is one of the few states where, we have a law now that protects Black women, wearing natural hair in the work, place and educational settings. But we know that's not everywhere. So it's complicated. But I think that it goes back to those basic things, right? Do we value dark-skinned children, right? Again, we can have all of the rhetoric, but when we know that when it comes with children, those are where the honest comments come. We think somebody's cute. Oh my God, you're so cute. Your hair, references around skin tone, all of that reproduces messages to Black children, whether they're, valued or not.
And I think that a lot of, because I have a 4-year-old, like this is always something that I'm conscious of. And I can vary from, wearing braids to straight hair to a wig. And, it's very versatile here. But she's always in front of the TV if there's like Esme and Roy, a little girl with a puff on her head, or like Michelle and Barack Obama's new series that's going to come out, little girl with 2 Afro puffs who's a scientist. So it's about being more practical and also intentional about what we're showing our kids. So even if they don't see it directly on me, right? So as a mom, like it's harder for me to manage my hair on a daily as an only parent. So sometimes I may have a hairstyle that's in for longer, or a sew-in that's in for longer. And, she sees that, but that in no way I feel I try to make it indicative of who she is and what she sees representative. And her grandma always has an afro. So those visuals are definitely important. But I think valuing, even if women want to wear weaves and things like that, is helpful to her as well.
Even beyond the children too, I think the next stage is, I think the kids, sorry, you're hearing my dog here. In the later on, what you hear is when they're in adolescence, girls start shifting from their parents to start thinking about the boys. And so the other point that we have to start thinking about is that feeling what is beautiful. And I'm saying boys in terms of what we're taught we're supposed to engage with, even if it might not be boys that we care about as our choice. But the idea of, and I think somebody called it like the male gaze is what was exactly what it is, and the male gaze, not exactly in terms of an individual, but what society tells us what appropriate womanhood is and femininity is too, that it's okay to be sexy. I think one of the worst things is to tell girls you can't, is to shut them down completely, but give them sense that they should have power and control over their bodies. They have the right to make decisions about their bodies, and that they should realize that there's degrees though. And so this is where it is that it's okay to want to be thin and be healthy, but is that the same as just having, ribs, tiny waist, and a big butt? And then talking about these things around, having discussions around body and talking about it really bluntly. And so having these discussions at age appropriate levels. But I also still think my work is with mainly college students, and they sit and they read these articles about the history of Black womanhood, and a lot of them, I've never heard this before. This is the first time. So I think we have to start giving a lot more of these discussions at, it's the same as sex education, is that it has to be age appropriate, but it has to be continuous, because it's going to be something, again, women and our bodies and what we're seeing out there is really going to be pushed. And also, as you get older, it might not be the Brazilian butt lift, it might be the facelift, it might be the breast lift. So it's just going to change for how much you normalize and how you view your body. But I think when it's adolescents and young women who are doing the Brazilian butt lift, it's the level of risk that's involved and the age at which they make the decision that makes that problematic. So my point is to have the conversations at age-appropriate levels continuously.
I also think that it's important because you mentioned, like when girls are in their adolescence, they start to think about the male gaze, or whatever their sexuality says that they should be thinking about, right? But that a part of it is the systems that govern our kids as well. So like when we think about dress codes, so instead of having a mask mandate, we still mandating that you can't wear spaghetti straps, right? Or that you can't uncover your shoulders, or you have to have appropriate knee-length skirts or something at school. So when we think about the systems that are governing our students, which of course they're trying to erase, like CRT and other forms that help us to inform our minds about how we should be thinking about our body, the historical presence of our bodies and the lack of agency to now having some type of autonomy to make these decisions and how we're negotiating that. It has to be a very, very strong emphasis in legislation for the school systems as well. Because I know that a lot of our students, all of our Black kids, are probably more than likely going to be public schooled. And if they are homeschooled, they may have a very good base for, depending on, who their homeschooling teacher is or what their foundations are, they'll be able to have a very good understanding of how to negotiate themselves in this world. But if they're socialized in a system that isn't going to grant them the opportunity to see themselves as how they want to see themselves, or give them that flexibility to be able to shift and modify their looks, then it only kind of puts them in a situation where they're always going to be looking to be governed by something to tell them how they should be looking.
Wonderful. So now if we switch that and look at it from a bird's eye view as researchers, where do y'all see the gaps in the literature, especially my thing going to a PWI and continuing my education at PWI? I'm seeing that the research being done on these topics that are not from Black women specifically or Black researchers, there seems to be a lot of gaps, a lot of disparities on how Black women are, first of all, how they're questioned, like if it's qualitative data, like the questions that are used, or how it's analyzed, and sometimes it's not culturally competent. I know that with my honors thesis, it was a qualitative research, and the way that I made it accessible is that the research was then put into a podcast, and then I put it out into the world. But a lot of the women said that they didn't see themselves as Afro Latinx. It was either or. You're either Black or you're Latinx. I think this goes into this as well, where looking from this ivory tower, how, like, what sorts of disparities do you see in the research when it comes to Black women and body modification and mental health?
I guess I'll start. As I mentioned, I used to research strip clubs a lot. And so, the research talks about feminist debates, obviously, women are objectifying themselves and that's bad, right? And, there's always a gap, and I'm glad you brought that up, in terms of, what's in the ivory tower and what's on the ground level. And the ground level is, some Black women are trying to work in strip clubs and they can't. They want to work in certain strip clubs and they can't, right? And again, that gets back to choice, and that's, it gets back to capitalism and agency and a lot of things. But I think, my intervention was to look at, it's not that Black women are being objectified per se in strip clubs, is that a lot of times they can't even get work in them. We assume that anybody can work in pornography, anybody can pose for Playboy. That's not true. There's a tier, just like there's segregation in education, segregation in housing. There's deep segregation in the sex industry, and Black women have a tier, right? They occupy a lower tier in sex work, and then they have to manipulate within that, right? And so I would say for me, that has been a gap, right? That there's this blanket statement that, everybody's exploited in the sex industry and it's bad and everybody's being objectified. And the reality is it's a stigma, a stratified sphere, right? And that the exploitation isn't because they're strippers. The exploitation is that they're underpaid, they're working in dangerous clubs, people don't want to see them, and they have to work harder with their bodies to make themselves more desirable to, clientele, including Black men, right? Oftentimes Black men don't want to see Black women either in these venues, right? And so I would say that that's one of my theoretical interventions, is really complicating what do we mean by exploitation? What do we mean by objectification?
Yeah, I think building on that, I think, like you said, the ivory tower is it's a separate space and from the real world often. And so I'm a psychology professor, and so we do all our work on the research, and the body image research comes from psychology. And the reality is, if you look at it, most of the research is on white populations because we pull from college students who are white students. This is a concern across the board that we're doing. But we actually have a study where the timeliness of this panel is interesting, because my earlier work was on the imagery of Black women in hip hop. And that's what I really looked at. And a lot of that looked at how people viewed the images and how it shaped behaviors. But what we did look at is preferred body shapes for Black women. And we asked them who were their favorite celebrities and what they liked about their celebrities. And we have a paper that should be coming out in the fall. And one of the things we found was that, first of all, there's a diversity when we're talking about Black women. We're talking like Black women are the same, but there's a huge diversity in terms of how Black women see themselves and how they see themselves as part of the Black community and how that means and how they look at their bodies. So, for example, in Miami, one of the big issues that we found with the African-American women were that the idea that women who were Latinx or from English-speaking Caribbean were viewed as more exotic, or sometimes they're, because of skin color played in, really shifted their value, which ties into what you're saying in the strip club. It wasn't just about being Black. It was also degrees that gave you access and privilege. And so that type of work has not been really we're just now, intersectionality is this new sexy term. It's been around for years, the concept's been around for years, but we're only beginning to see intersectionality being done by the mainstream research. And so we're going to start being able to look at that. And that's one of the problems too, is that we don't do work on Black populations because we focus on white populations. And secondly, we look at Blacks as one monolithic group and don't look at within group differences. And the third piece is we talk about body image. And body image is such a broad term. And it's not just about body image, it's about how people's body acceptance, perceptions of bodies. And so, as I was saying earlier, the study we found is that Black women were happy with their bodies, but what they broke down was they liked pieces. So they might not be happy with their breasts, or they weren't happy with their butts, but they might be happy with other pieces. So a lot of earlier research said that Black women are happy with their bodies. We really need to look at bodies in different ways, and particularly since social media partitions bodies in terms of how we look at it. So really what the research needs to move towards is looking at Black populations and looking at it in more diverse ways. And part of that will require having more Black women in tenure track positions who can lead this type of research, because we do research about what we love and what we care about. So, I mean, that's a whole nother level of discussion, but that's one of the ways that we need to start moving towards this.
I would say, because I was actually going to say similar to what you were saying, Dr. Stevens, was that there has to be a more nuanced way of how we're looking at Blackness and how we're looking at culture too, and what role that plays in how we're looking at these overall broad umbrellas of body modification, body image. Because one thing that I see in some of the frameworks that I use is that it's not detailed enough. It doesn't describe everyone. And sometimes when we do say, oh, well, I look at Black women's body image, that it excludes others. And especially in a place like Miami, where I do my research, everybody, even if you're from like a Caribbean island, like some of them don't consider themselves as just Black, right? They're either Jamaican, Caymanian, Bahamian, Cuban, all these different things. So how do we make these broad conceptualizations or generalizations or theoretical frameworks to explain what's happening? So I think that there has to be a more explication of the value, well, the terms that we're using to think about these groups.
And I think also, and this is to both your points, I think we need to look at the shifting nature of race in the United States and how it actually is shifting more to how we understand race in Latin America when it comes to Blackness, right? I mean, definitely you see that in California. It sounds like that's happening in Florida. You definitely see that in New York, where it's about gradations of Blackness. It's about, you know, skin color. It's almost beyond just colorism. It's almost like, you know, if given choices on the census, would people be some other race, right? I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about like Caribbeans and, you know, other people in the diaspora. You know, here it's like we want them to be Black, you know, because they're Black, but that's not how they understand themselves. And I think that links to Latin American categorizations of really complicated notions of race, but that reproduce notions of anti-Blackness too, in that, you know, you have Black people, if given the chance, will they be something different than Black?
I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Brooks. And that's a lot of what I saw in the literature that I looked at, is that a lot of Latinx countries, because I'm a Panamanian native, don't even know about the anti-Blackness or how much Blackness was hidden in their own country's history. And now that they are maybe first or second generation immigrants in their households here in the US, then it's even more, there's more erasure, and then they're facing anti-Blackness in this country. So it's very, very complex. I do want to note that we are open for questions from the audience and comments from the audience. But I also want to talk about a different intersection, a different part of intersection, a different factor, which is sexuality and sexual identity and gender identity, because we are talking about Black women, but also how I know there's a lack of research in Black women, but even larger gap, on Black trans women, and women within different sexual identities. So do we want to talk about that a little bit if we can?
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit. My research examines Black LGBT identity, hence the title of my second book. And I think, you know, I did an article for the Black Scholar that was about Black lesbians choosing Black women as you know, sexual partners. And then even there's stereotypes about the stud, stereotypes about, you know, Black women being undesirable. You know, we often kind of look at that as a very heteronormative thing, that like Black women are undesirable as potential partners for people. I was surprised that exists in the Black lesbian community as well. Now, maybe not to the same degree as we know about it in the heterosexual community, but that's there as well. And I think for Black trans women, thinking about some of my other articles about how Black queer people manage queer identity in Black spaces, you know, a lot of times it's about safety and it's about passing, right? It's about, you know, Black trans women need to pass for survival, right? Whether that's, you know, social, economical, right? And so, but then that gets us back to resources, right? You have to have resources to have surgeries, right? So
I think that's a good, and I remember the big case with the butt lifts. And that was the one where every newspaper was calling me when there was a big case where a girl, a model, got her injections and died. She drove to Mississippi and she was in Atlanta. And that was in 2014. And I was interviewed all over the place. And I know these cases happened all the time, but I think the reason the media picked it up was because the person that was giving the injections was a trans woman. And they loved to plaster her face all over the news. And they love to have pictures of her in her jail uniform. And clearly she's put in a men's jail at the time, because then she wasn't able to do her hair. And they would show these before and after pictures, which had nothing to do with her surgery. And so what it was I also think people were asking, well, why was she involved? And I think it goes back to exactly what you said, is you have to think about that. One, there's a lot of homophobia in the Black community. There are people who don't view trans women as women. There are people, so as a result, this whole passing and the need for doing these surgeries becomes, even, like you said, a matter of life and death for a lot of trans women for survival. And so the need for doing these, the Brazilian butt lifts have even a more intense need within this population than it does for women who might not be having that type of pressure. There might be a level of choice that might not be the same type of choice that's happening with trans women, but that passing requires them to play on these hypersexualized body images of Black womanhood as a means of survival.
I mean, when you were talking, one of the things that, you know, and I love Pose. I thought Pose was great. I'm so sad it ended, you know. But one of the things that was interesting is, you know, looking at the Black trans women that have made it that we know about in the media are all ones that can pass as non-trans, right? And so it just brings up questions of, even within that category, what do we mean? You know, are we really about, you know, is it about always trying to get out of a, you know, gender binary? And I think it's complicated, right? I mean, obviously you have gender nonconforming people, right? And then you have trans Black women that I think, again, because of survival and because of capitalism, it's very pertinent that they pass, right? And then it becomes a question of again, we're back to that question of, but what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of womanhood? You know, what kind of womanhood are we trying to achieve?
And even going to Pose, when we talk about all those women did the surgeries, but there was a whole debate about the lighter skin in the trans women tended to get more privileges and more access to things. So it was really it shows how messy it is for women, that our bodies, again, are these tools, or they are a source of power, unfortunately, that it's one of the few sources of power that women, particularly women who don't have a lot of resources, have to use as a way of survival. And go back to the whole purpose of the talk here is how does that inform your willingness to go through changing your body, and to what degree are you willing to change your body, given that it's so important, or it appears to be so important in terms of being able to have social mobility or social capital.
Yes, and I think that may open the conversation or future conversations to now with, there may be more research on Black trans women and their efforts to also try to conform to these body types, which will also, we'll see a rise in how dangerous these processes are, and not just body modification in terms of BBLs, but also skin bleaching and bleaching and skin whitening and teeth whitening and hair and straightening hair and all of those like chemicals that people put in their hair. Yeah. So I'm looking here at the comments, but it's also, we have 5 minutes left. Wow, that was fast. We can wrap up if there are any last words. We can go into those and give y'all each a moment of spotlight to plug any books, any research coming out, websites, anything.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'll just say that and just say there is some great work coming up by Dr. Jessica Saunders at Clark University, and I'm working with her, and we have a whole data set that was collected exclusively with Latina and Black women, and it's a mixed method, qualitative and quantitative, over 1,500, and we're looking at a lot of these questions around body image from an intersectional perspective. And the first one's coming about Black celebrity images, where there's a comparison between Hispanic women and Black women's body images, and how it ties into beauty acceptance and goals around dating partnerships. And so all of that research will be available on my faculty website, which is just dionstevens.com.
And as was mentioned, I have a new book out, Everyday Violence Against Black and Latinx LGBT Communities, that came out last year from Lexington Press. That's also on my faculty website at Cal State Fullerton, that looks at sort of using the Pulse shooting as a kind of standing point to look at what are the multiple ways in which Black and Latinx LGBT people are, marginalized in our own communities and also in the larger society.
And finally, I produced the children's book, Sunflower Child, which is available on Amazon and also sunflowerchildmiami.com. And I'm also working on a book called Erasing Maternity that looks at the intersection of Black maternal health and then also body image and modification for Black women.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Y'all are amazing, truly. We appreciate you so much for being on this panel. I believe Riel.
Like, do you even know who you are?